Good morning from Singapore. Welcome to the launch of the ASEAN+3 Regional Economic Outlook 2022, or AREO for short. The AREO is the annual flagship report published by the ASEAN+3 Macroeconomic Research Office, or AMRO. My name is Glenn Van Zutphen, and I'll be moderating today's session. Also here with me in the studio are Dr. Ho-E Kor, AMRO's chief economist, and Anthony Tan, the senior economist and co-author of the report. Well, since 2017, the AREO has provided a comprehensive assessment of economic issues facing the ASEAN+3 region. By that, I mean the 10 members of the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, as well as China, Hong Kong, Japan, and Korea. The AREO 2022 discusses the most pressing issues of the region's growth outlook against the backdrop of the ongoing pandemic and emerging risks. The report also contains a thematic chapter on ASEAN+3's region's growth strategy in the pandemic's wake. We'll discuss that chapter during tomorrow's webinar. But for today, let's focus on the regional economic outlook, risks, and policy considerations. AMRO policy advisors will consider the headwinds to growth, the pandemic's impact, and new risks as well. We'll also look at what's the next on the economic agenda of policymakers. And later in the session, we'll put your questions to our economists. But let's begin with opening remarks from AMRO Director Toshinori Doi. Mr. Doi, please.
Since the outbreak of COVID-19 in 2020, ASEAN+3 economies have been in a battle to tame the virus for control of their economies while saving lives. And they have come far in their journey. Last year, the availability of effective vaccines and the rapid rollout of vaccination programs enabled ASEAN+3 economies to relax some containment measures. This helped to facilitate reopening. Today, more than 70% of the region's population are fully vaccinated. As we move forward in 2022, the region's economic growth is expected to normalize as the pandemic recedes. However, the outlook is clouded by new risks. Our war in Ukraine has now been piled on top of the COVID health crisis. Since the war started in February, the situation has seen no clear resolution. Beyond the humanitarian crisis, the war promises to threaten an already fragile global recovery if it is prolonged. ASEAN+3 policymakers have to navigate this complex environment, strengthen economic recovery, and rebuild policy space. Can ASEAN+3 weather this perfect storm of a war during a pandemic? I'm sure the region can overcome it collectively by upholding multilateralism and working together to find solutions to global problems. We have done it before, and we'll do it again. Since the Asian financial crisis, policymakers in the region have worked hard to build up their buffers, which they put to good use to support the economies during the rainy days of the pandemic. After the crisis, there will be others to come. We must rebuild and arm ourselves with knowledge. Preparedness is like breathing. If you don't, you perish. As for AMRO, our role is to spot the risks and vulnerabilities and provide policy advice to member economies. As a family doctor, we assess if the economic health of our members is in good shape. Our emergency ward is always on standby to respond to crisis. With more complex and larger scale risks on the horizon, AMRO's role as the region's doctor is more important than ever. In a few moments, you will hear more from AMRO Chief Economist Dr. Ho-E Kor and Senior Economist Anthony Tan. I'll leave you with this quote from Nelson Mandela. The greatest glory in living lies not in never falling, but in rising every time we fall. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Mr. Doi. Before we hear the key findings of the REO 2022, we have a question for the journalists watching today. Please cast your vote in the window on the right side of your screen to this question. And that is, what is the biggest risk to growth in your economy this year? Is it the war in Ukraine, COVID-19, high inflation, rising interest rates, or high unemployment? Again, journalists, please cast your votes in the window on the right side of your screen. We'll show the results in just a little while. You may also submit your questions on the same window under the Q&A tab. Now, let me invite Ho-Yi to take us through the key findings of the REO 2022. Ho-Yi.
Thank you, Glenn. Good morning, everyone. Thanks for coming to the launch of our annual flagship report, REO 22. The report contains our assessment of the risks, vulnerabilities, and challenges facing the region, and our forecast of the growth for this year and next. It also contains our assessment of the appropriate policy response that should be taken by the authorities in the region. Let me begin my presentation with a summary of the key risks facing the ASEAN+3 region. This risk map contains 6 key risks that we identified. These are the risks that can derail the economic recovery in the region if they materialize. They are the supply chain disruptions, financial distress in the private sector, a prolonged war in Ukraine, a sharper than expected Fed tightening, a more virulent pandemic, and sovereign debt distress. In the interest of time, I will focus on 3 key risks in the short term. They are the emergence of a more virulent COVID-19 variant, a prolonged war in Ukraine, and a sharper than expected Fed tightening. I will now explain these risks in greater detail. First, the pandemic. The COVID-19 pandemic has lasted longer and with greater intensity than expected. The left-hand side chart shows the different waves of the pandemic over the last 2 years. As you can see, each wave is bigger than the last one. However, in terms of impact, the earlier waves were more severe and damaging than the later ones. Why is that so? If you look at the right-hand side chart, you will see why. The vaccination rates in the region have risen sharply only since the middle of last year and have reached relatively high levels, between 60 to 90%. As a result, the populations are now well protected against the severe symptoms, even though the Omicron is more infectious and milder. As a result, the economies have maintained relatively open during the surge in infections. And now that the infections have subsided, they are reopening their economies. Our assessment, therefore, is that unless a more virulent variant emerges, which is resistant to the vaccines, the economies are likely to remain quite open and will be able to recover quite strongly this year. Next, let me elaborate further on the impact of the Russia-Ukraine conflict on the ASEAN+3 region. This diagram shows the different channels through which the impact is transmitted to the region. The direct impact of the conflict via the region's trade and investment exposure to Russia and Ukraine is likely to be quite small. That's the top pin box that you see in the chart. However, the conflict will exert a significant indirect impact on the region via the hit to global commodity prices, global transportation routes, and global growth. That's the lower box, the indirect impact. This would in turn lead to higher inflation, supply chain disruptions, and lower net exports. If the crisis is prolonged and the sanctions continue to escalate, global growth would likely be more impacted than what we have seen so far, resulting possibly in recession in the major economies. This would in turn reduce demand for the region's exports and adversely affect the economic growth for regional economies. US monetary policy will also have a significant spillover effect for the region. The left-hand side chart shows the US Treasury yield curves. The one in light blue is the yield curve before 2019, in 2019 before the pandemic. As you can see, the yield curve fell to a lower level as the Fed cuts its policy rate to almost zero in 2020. However, in the last 4 months, the yield curve has shifted upward, especially at the mid to long end of the yield curve, reflecting the sharp rise in inflation and expectation of Fed rate hikes. The right-hand side chart shows that after the first rate hike last month, the US Fed is expected to raise interest rate by at least 6 more times for the rest of 2022 and an additional 4 times by the end of 2023. The Fed fund rate is expected to surpass pre-pandemic rates of 2.375 by the middle of next year. A more aggressive move by the Fed to rein in inflationary pressure could trigger a repricing of risk assets and cause a substantial tightening in global financial conditions. This would in turn compel regional central banks to tighten their monetary policy prematurely and could possibly derail their recovery. Fundamentally, the drivers of growth for the ASEAN+3 region remains intact. The region has benefited from broad-based improvements in external demand since last year. The red line in the left-hand side chart shows a strong recovery in goods exports. This year, we expect goods export to remain robust, underpinned by continued strong growth in the US and EU, which, despite the ongoing war in Ukraine, is still expected to grow robustly this year. The right-hand side chart shows that services export have also recovered, although they have lagged behind goods exports. However, the ongoing reopening of borders this year should provide a boost to the recovery in services exports. This is a heat map for the manufacturing PMI. As you can see, the manufacturing activity globally and in the region have improved significantly since the middle of last year. The PMI in the region turned red in the middle of 2021, especially in the ASEAN countries, because of the Delta outbreak, but have since turned greenish, although it turns reddish in some economies, especially China and Hong Kong, and that's because of the recent Omicron outbreak. The recovery this year will be boosted by domestic demand, reflecting the opening of the economies. The left-hand side chart shows that mobility has recovered to almost pre-pandemic level in the ASEAN region. The relaxation of mobility restrictions in many ASEAN+3 economies in recent weeks have allowed economic activities to resume. The right-hand side chart shows the heat map for retail sales, which is likely to turn more green going forward, reflecting higher spending by households as the economy recovers. Turning to inflation, headline inflation in the region remains low so far. Compared to the US and emerging market economies in other regions, this will allow policies in the ASEAN+3 to remain supportive of growth. And you can see that on the left-hand side chart, where the line for ASEAN+3 is much lower than the US and emerging markets. The low inflation partly reflects the policy intervention and price subsidies for essential goods. It also reflects weaker demand, as the regional recovery has been relatively weak, and output gap was still negative for most countries in the region. The right-hand side chart shows the sharp increases in prices of raw materials as a result of the war in Ukraine. This is likely to raise inflationary pressure for regional economies. It has already shown up in higher inflation in many of the regional economies, which are energy importers. One of the key risks that we identify is financial distress in the private sector. The pandemic has taken a toll on the balance sheets of households and businesses because of the loss of income. The left-hand side chart shows the debt at risk of the corporate sector for countries in the region. As you can see, the debt at risk spiked up in 2020, the middle bar, but it came down in 2021, thanks to the economic rebound and lower interest rates. It is also reassuring to note that banks across the region are well capitalized. We conducted a reverse solvency test and found that non-performing loans would have to increase by an average of 10 percentage points. That's the red bar on the right-hand side, before the capital adequacy ratios for the banks will fall to below the regulatory minima. So in our view, a major financial crisis is unlikely at this juncture. Let me now summarize our outlook for the ASEAN+3 region. We project growth for the region to moderate, but remain relatively robust at 4.7% this year and 4.6% next year. The moderation in growth is mainly due to the +3 economies, especially China, which successfully contained the COVID-19 pandemic in 2020 and registered a very strong rebound last year. So you can see growth last year was 8.1% and is expected to moderate to 5.2% this year. The ASEAN+3 region, the ASEAN region, on the other hand, is expected to grow at a stronger pace of 5.1% this year, after a slower growth of 2.9% last year, and that was because of the outbreak of the Delta variant. Inflation is also expected to be higher this year, 3.5%, before moderating to 2.3% next year. Prices are likely to spike up this year, due mainly to increases in global commodity prices on account of the Russia-Ukraine conflict. The improvement in domestic demand, particularly among ASEAN economies, will also contribute to higher inflation. Inflation is expected to return to its long-term trend in 2023 as cost pressures ease and demand pressures normalize. Macro policies in the region, by and large, continue to be focused on alleviating the impact of the pandemic and supporting economic recovery. The left-hand side chart shows that most central banks cut their interest rates in 2020 and have continued to maintain a largely accommodative monetary policy stance. Singapore and Korea, which have recovered earlier than most regional economies, have begun normalization of their monetary policies, and you can see that arrow moving upwards. The right-hand side chart shows the sharp increase in fiscal deficits in 2020 as regional governments roll out large fiscal packages to support the economies. That's the red bar that you see. That's for 2020. Since then, some regional economies have reduced their support as the economies recover, while others have continued to extend support due to the weak recovery of the economies. Generally, the broad-based fiscal support in 2020 have been followed by a more targeted approach since last year. This year, we expect more governments to reduce their fiscal support, except for some countries like Vietnam and China, which are likely to increase the fiscal support to boost economic or support economic growth because of the Omicron outbreak. This chart summarizes the macro financial policy stance of the economies in the region. The far left-hand columns show that most governments have started to consolidate their fiscal policy. And you can see that by the change in the color from green to orange on the left-hand side. The middle column shows that monetary policies are still accommodative. They're all mostly green. And on the next column, the macroprudential policies, they are relatively mixed, and that depends on the individual circumstances of the countries. The far right-hand column shows that credit policies have remained supportive in almost all economies. Let me now conclude with our key messages. Growth in the region, we expect growth in the region to remain robust at 4.6 to 4.7% this year, supported by the resumption of economic activities as the pandemic recedes. Growth for the ASEAN region could be stronger at 5.1% and 5.2% next year. Of course, there are risks to the outlook, and they are tilted to the downside, with the war in Ukraine still evolving and bearing a close watch. As we transition out of fighting a pandemic, policymakers need to balance between rebuilding policy space and supporting economic recovery. Let me stop here. Thank you. Back to you, Glenn.
Owe, thank you very much for your presentation. The report and the press release are now available for downloading on AMRO's website. You can scan the QR code that you see here on your screen or go to AMRO-Asia.org to get your free copies for that. And before we start our Q&A session, let's look at the results of our earlier poll question to you. Those of you who voted indicated that COVID-19 by far is going to be the biggest risk to growth in your economy this year, followed not too far back by the war in Ukraine and high inflation. It appears that rising interest rates are fairly low down on the list. Interesting insights from those of you today. Thank you for putting in your thoughts on our poll about impact around the region. Well, we've received a lot of questions ahead of today's event, and we'll answer some of them along with those that you are sending in right now. While we're waiting for more questions, let's get started with one of our earlier questions from RTM Malaysia. Howie, let's give this one to you, talking about the war in Ukraine and the spikes in commodity prices that we've all been aware of could potentially disrupt production of semiconductors. How do you think that the Russia-Ukraine crisis will impact the growth forecast for the region this year among ASEAN+3 economies who are the gainers and who are the losers if the war persists? Howie.
Thank you, Glenn. Indeed, there will be winners and losers. Russia and Ukraine are major producers of commodities: oil, gas, wheat, sunflower oil, neon gas, and palladium. And most of the countries in the region are energy importers. So there will be adverse terms of trade for most of the countries in the region. And this will show up also in high inflation, which will dampen growth, especially consumption. On the other hand, there are a few economies in the region, Brunei, Malaysia, Indonesia, which are commodity producers, and they will benefit from an improvement in the terms of trade. So for some countries in the region, they would also have price subsidies, and this would show up in terms of fiscal burden, higher fiscal burden. On the disruption to semiconductor production, as you know, Russia is a major producer of neon gas and palladium, which are key intermediate inputs into the semiconductor production. So if there's a shortage of those commodities, they are likely to be badly affected. And finally, one of our major concerns is that if the war gets prolonged and energy prices continue to spike up, we could have a situation of a global stagflation, especially in the US, especially in the EU, but also in the US. So as these economies are major trading partners for the region's export and GDP growth are likely to be significantly impacted. And most of them and that could derail the recovery, and it could show up in terms of lower growth or even recession. Thank you.
All right. Thanks, Howie. Anthony Tan, let's bring you in the discussion. Nice to see you today. Let's talk about inflation. Higher inflation globally has caused the Fed and many central banks to start raising interest rates. ASEAN central banks, however, have been generally reluctant to do so. Are the central banks falling behind the curve? Is there risk that inflation may get out of control in this region? What do you think, Anthony?
Thanks, Glenn, for the question. Indeed, rising commodity prices has underpinned the upward drift in CPI inflation globally, and this has raised inflationary concerns. Now, as was presented by Dr. Koh in the presentation, you can see that if you look at ASEAN+3 region headline CPI developments, if you compare that against other advanced economies or other emerging markets, the headline CPI developments is pretty contained, I would say, so far. So the relatively restrained CPI inflation partly reflects the policy interventions and the price stabilization mechanisms that are in place in some of these regional economies. So that has sort of put a lead on the price pressure in the region. Price mechanisms such as the administered prices and subsidies on food, energy, and essential goods like cooking oil and flour, these have helped to suppress, I would say, some of the upward pressure on inflation. So for this year, we expect inflation for the ASEAN+3 region to rise to 3.5% before moderating to 2.3% next year. There are, of course, upside risk, and we are watching this risk closely. Now, with regards to policy, with inflation largely under control, there is scope for monetary policy to be accommodative. But as the recovery strengthens and the output gap narrows, policymakers should stand ready to normalize the degree of monetary policy accommodation while taking into account the changing external environment. So let me stop here, Glenn. Back to you.
Anthony, thank you very much. Our next couple of questions are coming in from the China Daily. And Hui, let's go to you for this first one. How will the COVID-19 breakout and relevant pandemic prevention and control measures affect China's economic development this year?
Yeah, the current outbreak is likely to have a dampening effect on growth and the ability of the Chinese economy to achieve the 5.5% growth target that is set for themselves. The severity of the outbreak obviously will depend on how effective the measures to contain the pandemic are and whether it continues to spread from cities to cities. The impact will be quite significant, and the government may have to take some measures to boost the economy. Fortunately, the government has a lot of policy space, and they can use that to support the economy. On the question of relaxing the dynamic zero-COVID policy, that's a very difficult decision that only the Chinese government and the people can make, because it's about the trade-off between saving life and saving livelihoods. Although the Omicron variant is quite infectious and hard to contain, the cost of containing the virus has been pretty harsh. And so but the fatality rate has been pretty low so far because of the very high vaccination rate. As you know, most of the cases are asymptomatic, more than 90% in fact. So we know that the severe cases have been quite small, but even so, because China is such a large country, a low fatality rate could result in millions of infections, severe infections, and maybe millions of deaths. So because of this, I think it's a very hard decision that only the Chinese government can make.
Yep. All right, Hui, let's stay with you for the next question, which is around economic growth in China. Do you think that China, and this again comes from the China Daily, do you think China can achieve its economic growth target of around 5.5% in this year?
Well, China faces several headwinds. I just mentioned the pandemic, but also they have headwinds from the geopolitical tension between them and the US, and that's the war in Ukraine. And that could lead to significant supply chain disruption, which will impact on China as well. And also, China has been introducing reform in the tech sector and also in the property sector, and that has led to some distress in some of the big developers. So all these are headwinds, that are impacting the economy. But as I said earlier, the Chinese government, they do have a lot of fiscal policy space, and which they can use to support the economy. So I think they will try to keep the growth up. It will be a challenge, but possibly 5% is achievable. Yeah.
Okay, thanks, Hui. Anthony, let's ask you a question, staying with our China theme, a more macro China question related to the rest of the region. While the rest of the region is reopening borders and there's more travel happening, there's little or no sign that China is going to do so soon. As the latest source of tourists for the region before the pandemic, how will this affect the recovery and development of the tourism sector, specifically in the region? More broadly, how will it affect the recovery of tourism-dependent economies across the region? What do you think?
Thanks, Glenn. Yes, to provide a context, prior to the pandemic in 2019, there were more than 80 million Chinese tourists in the region. And that's a big number, and that's the largest source of tourist arrivals for most regional economies. And I agree with you, yes, the relatively tight border restrictions in China at this moment will definitely weigh on the pace of recovery in the tourism sector, particularly for those regional economies that are more dependent on tourism, notably Thailand, Cambodia, Vietnam. Now, these economies have sought to mitigate the loss of tourism revenue from China by gradually relaxing their travel restrictions. Just earlier this month, Thailand has removed the pre-departure testing requirements, and this will certainly help. Yeah, but it also depends on the progress of the economic reopening and border adjustments in other countries. Similarly, in Cambodia and in Vietnam, prior to the pandemic, Chinese tourists accounts for about a third of their total tourist arrivals in the country. So the loss of this market has been pretty significant. Now, while efforts are being undertaken to sort of diversify tourism revenue instead of relying on a particular source, this sort of diversification efforts is really a multi-year effort, and there is no quick gains in the short term, and certainly will take some time. So having said that, we have seen how some regional economies like Indonesia, a good example, they have been trying to push to promote domestic tourism activities. And these will really help in the short term to sort of invigorate the tourism activities, such as in Bali. Yeah? In our report, we do not expect the return of international tourism to pre-COVID levels until mid next year. So let me stop here. Back to you, Glenn.
Okay, thank you, Anthony. Ho-E, let's talk now about some of the debt distress, among emerging ASEAN economies. The pandemic has led to highly expansionary fiscal stimulus policies, large increases in government debt. Are you concerned that this high debt will lead to a sovereign debt crisis among some of the ASEAN emerging market economies? What do you think?
Thank you, Glenn. Yes, certainly the very large fiscal stimulus over the last few years have led to a very large increase in government debt across the region, ranging between 10 to 20%. So a lot of analysts and observers have worried about the sustainability of the debt. As it turns out, because the region had built up significant fiscal space, and reserve, they were able to finance the large fiscal deficit quite comfortably in the last 2 years. And most of the financing have come from domestic savings. There was a collapse in domestic demand, and financial savings went up. And a lot of that was rechanneled into government bonds. So if you look at the data, you find that foreign holdings of domestic currency bond is actually quite low. And because of this, and because of the lower interest rate, the servicing of the debt is not a problem at the moment. But of course, if interest rate would spike up very sharply, which we don't expect, then it could be a burden. But in any case, I think the region has managed very well, and we feel that there's no risk of financial sovereign debt crisis at this juncture.
Thanks, Ho-E. Let's stay with you for a moment. Another question coming in from the China Daily about how the pandemic will change the regional economic landscape. Could the ASEAN+3 economies, what could they do to advance shared interests and contribute to the global economy? Ho-E, what do you think about that?
Yes, the pandemic has changed a lot of things, especially the way business operates, technology, social norms, behavior, and some of these changes are likely to be quite permanent. They have boosted e-commerce, digital financial services, e-payments, and they have changed the way business are conducted, a lot of video conferencing and all that. So those are all permanent shifts in behavior that we expect will continue going forward. And a lot of that could also lead to higher productivity. But one thing we know is that a lot of these digital services operate on economy of scale, and they have a network effect. So one thing the region could do is to try to facilitate this digital technology by cooperating to harmonize the regulatory regime, to improve connectivity, cross-border flows, and digital integration. I think this will help the region in order to leverage on the digital technology and boost its productivity and growth.
All right, thank you, Ho-E. Anthony, let's shift from China to Vietnam. And this question coming in from the Vietnam news agency and VTV. Can you assess Vietnam's economic recovery prospects in 2022? what are the main challenges to Vietnam's economic growth this year, and how should the government mitigate risk and support economic growth? What do you think?
Thanks, Glenn. If you look at Vietnam, our forecast is for the country to grow by 6.5% this year. This forecast is on the optimistic side, as we expect a stronger rebound from fourth quarter to continue into the rest of this year. Certainly, we know that Vietnam has been hit by the Delta variant last year. In fact, the third quarter GDP print were somewhat weaker than expected, so we do expect some base effects to kick in this year. Now, more fundamentally, as Dr. Koh has pointed out in the presentation, Vietnam has achieved a high rate of vaccination, and this has enabled the gradual easing of containment measures and economic reopening. Now, on the demand side, the growth will be underpinned by consumption, resilient FDI, strong exports, and a supportive fiscal policy stance. We do see that the manufacturing sector is going to be the sector that's going to see fastest recovery, given that Vietnam is a trade-oriented economy. Yeah, so some turnaround in the contact-intensive sectors will also help as we move into the end of this year. Turning to inflation, I would say that the country's inflation pressure stays low so far, but warrants close monitoring. Now, turning to risks, if we look at the broader risks, we would say that the forecast, risk to the forecast would be broadly balanced. The main downside risk stems from disruptions to recent geopolitical developments, tightening of financial conditions in major advanced countries, and sustained high global commodity prices. Now, on the downside, we do see, for the upside risk, we do see faster than expected growth in private consumption, pent-up demand, and supportive macroeconomic stance. Now, on the questions of what we see as the key major challenges in the years to come, I would say that over the next 2 years, the key challenge is how to unwind or stage a skillful policy exit from the unprecedented fiscal stimulus introduced since the outbreak of the pandemic. Now, we know that this is a topic that we'll be also addressing tomorrow in the webinar. Given the potential scarring effects from the pandemic, it is also important for the country to assess and address some of the scarring effects. And this could take various forms. For example, in Vietnam, we are expecting that some of these prominent scarring effects will take place in the banking sector, among the SMEs, and also, of course, in the labor market. Now, what is necessary to roll back some of these pandemic-related policy measures, it is also important that we assure that these rollbacks of policies are more gradual and they are targeted if the policies are to continue, so that the vulnerable groups will be protected to maintain some social stability. And over the longer term, what we see as the key challenges is, of course, for Vietnam to accelerate the reform policy to foster growth potential while enhancing productivity to overcome the longer-term effects of shifting demographics. So let me stop here, Glenn. Back to you.
All right. Thanks, Anthony. And Anthony, just a quick follow-on question. You talked about the policy exit, some of the scarring happening in Vietnam. What would you expect to be some of the better sectors in Vietnam that would see the fastest recovery? Any predictions on what those sectors might look like in Vietnam?
Yeah, sure. As I said earlier, it's the manufacturing sector, and within the manufacturing sector, the trade-related ones, those are related to semiconductors, ICT. Okay. We know that Vietnam is a big player in this. In fact, it's a hub. We have major players in the countries like Samsung, and these are the drivers of growth that I see would be the key ones for Vietnam.
Great.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Huy, let's go back to you and turn now to the Philippines. This question coming in from the Philippine news agency, Business World and ABS-CBN. What growth rate are you projecting for the Philippines this year, given the threat of more COVID-19 variants and the acceleration of inflation rates, given the Russian-Ukraine war? What are you seeing there for the Philippines?
Thank you, Glenn. Well, this year we expect the Philippines to grow by 6.5%. That was what we expected last year. Unfortunately, because of the Delta variant, growth was shaded down. But nevertheless, Philippines registered 5.5% growth last year, and this year we expect growth to improve to 6.5%. And this will be led by government spending to some and also a recovery in private sector spending. The Philippine economy still has a pretty large output gap, so we expect that private spending will bounce back very rapidly once the economy is open much more fully. So we are quite confident that that this 6.5% growth can be achieved this year, and we expect growth of another 6.5% for next year.
Hoey, staying on that theme of the Philippines, again from the Philippine Star, Philippine News Agency, and ABS-CBN, with rising inflation, do you expect the Philippine Central Bank to reverse it into tightening mode by raising interest rates? What's your prediction on that?
Inflation has ticked up and is already above the upper band of the target band. So it's about, when we expect inflation to remain above the target band for most of the year. And so inflation is driven mostly by increases in fuel prices and food. So they are basically supply-driven, supply shocks. As I mentioned earlier, the Philippine economy still has a negative output gap. They have not fully recovered to pre-pandemic levels. So demand is still, I wouldn't say it's very weak, but it's still modest. So on the demand side, we don't see very strong impetus to growth. So because of that, I think inflation is likely to decline down to within the target band by next year, and we don't see the urgent need to raise policy rate. But having said that, it's important to make sure that inflation doesn't become entrenched, and there's scope, I think, for the BSP or the central bank to start considering withdrawing some of the policy stimulus, as the economy continues to gain traction and growth continues to recover.
Okay, I'm not going to let you off the hook quite yet. Let's turn to Malaysia. A question coming in from Nanyang Siang Pao. What do you think is the biggest threat to Malaysia's growth this year, and how many rounds of rate hikes do you predict the BNM will raise this year? What do you think about that, Hoey?
I think.
Or Anthony, would you like to tackle that one?
Sure.
Well, maybe let me start.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, I think Malaysia's policy rate is at the moment about 1.75, and Malaysia has always maintained a relatively high interest rate, and even though they cut rates, it has been still relatively high compared to the other countries in the region, in real terms. That's what I mean. Of course, now that inflation is picking up, there is a risk that inflation will turn negative, and so there may be scope for the Bank Negara to start considering when to raise rates. But this will obviously depend very much on the recovery. Malaysia was hit quite badly by the Delta outbreak last year, and this year we are hoping that the economy will be able to attain 6.5% growth. And so if the economy does indeed pick up traction, then I think it will be prudent for Bank Negara to start withdrawing the policy stimulus and allow some increase in the policy rate. But exactly when that would take place, I think is a decision for Bank Negara to make.
Yeah, perhaps I can add to what Dr. Koh has said.
Please.
Well, Malaysia, as compared to other regions, also steadily emerging from the pandemic. But we have to remember, because the recovery within the country itself is uneven. There's a K-shaped recovery. Some sectors are doing fine, but some sectors are still lagging behind. So we know that monetary policy tool is pretty blunt when you want to address some of this unevenness and try to promote a sustainable growth. So long as the inflation remains low, there is scope for monetary authorities to be flexible, I would say, and try to keep policy supportive. But so long as the recovery it's entrenched, where output gap is steadily narrowing, then I would see that there's, as Dr. Kor said, it would be prudent for Vietnam to start adjusting their degree of monetary accommodation. Thank you.
Anthony, let's stay with you for a moment. High fuel prices have been on everybody's radar. We know certainly here in Singapore we've been hit with the petrol prices and diesel increases. Do you think that high global oil prices will put pressure on the Bank of Korea to speed up monetary policy normalization?
Thanks, Glenn. Well, Korea was the first regional economy to raise policy rates since the start of the coronavirus era. In fact, BOK has increased its base rate to where it was before the pandemic. Now, I would say that, yes, the inflationary pressures are coming from the supply side, notably the oil prices, energy, but high consumer price inflation alone will unlikely to be the sole determinant. What is important, as I said earlier, the Korean economy is also experiencing this K-shaped trajectory in terms of its growth. And there are also concerns about financial imbalances at the same time. So if we have a sharply higher borrowing cost, it would not only derail the economic recovery, which as I said earlier, remains uneven, but it will also undermine the financial position of low-income households and vulnerable groups. So I would say that the conduct of policy, the calibration of policy needs to be balanced, taking into account not just the inflationary concerns, but growth and financial stability considerations. So let me stop here. Thank you.
All right. Thanks, Anthony. Hui, when do you expect the Bank Indonesia to raise its policy rates, and what do you think their policy stance will look like for the latter part of this year?
Yeah, this is a question that has been posed to the governor of Bank Indonesia by many analysts, and he has responded that they will start raising rates when they see inflation become a real threat to growth. And I think that's very prudent. Indonesia has managed its the crisis very well, especially Bank Indonesia. And because of that, they've managed to anchor inflation at a relatively low level. So inflation, although it's picking up, is still one of the lowest in the region, and especially among emerging markets economy. So that gives them policy space. They don't have to, respond very quickly, unlike some of the other emerging markets. Also, the external position has strengthened during the last 2 years. So they are also much more resilient now to shocks from capital flow side. So for these two reasons, I think, Bank Indonesia is comfortable with keeping the rates where it is right now to support growth. But when the risks arise and inflation begins to pick up, I think Bank Indonesia will respond.
Thanks, Hui. Another question just coming in now about Japan. And there's been some speculation about a potential sovereign rating downgrade for Japan. How do you assess the likelihood of this scenario playing out?
Well, we look at this issue in our recent consultation discussion with Japan. We did a study on it. And I think the big concern is the sovereign debt, which is at the highest in the world, 260%. And because of very large fiscal packages, it's likely to rise further to about 285%. And so it's important for the authorities to start consolidating and reduce the debt, or at least stabilize it and make sure that it doesn't continue to grow. So this is a longer-term risk. It's not immediate. Japan is the biggest creditor country in the world, and so they have a lot of ammunition to support the exchange rate, and also they are major creditor countries. So there's no immediate risk that they will be downgraded. But certainly, I think markets are concerned about the high level of the sovereign debt, and if it continues to grow, there's a risk that they might be downgraded. Yeah.
All right, thank you, Hui. Anthony, let's talk about Hong Kong for a moment. It's been on a lot of people's radars, especially in this zero COVID strategy that's been playing out there. Is its business reputation at risk due to that strategy right now. How far can this go before we see any kind of reputational risk?
Thanks, Glenn. I would start by sharing our growth forecast for Hong Kong. Now, Hong Kong's economy is rebounded strongly in 2021, and we are expecting a growth of 6.4% this year. And of course, downside risks are predominant, including the projected wave of COVID-19 infections and the spillovers from this zero COVID strategy. Now, addressing the question directly, I would say that a delicate balance needs to be struck for border reopening when it comes to China and Hong Kong. The cost of the zero COVID strategy could increase over time, no doubt about that. As more and more economies and other financial centers have chosen to live with COVID, Hong Kong's competitiveness could also be adversely affected given this strategy that are in place. So I would say that prolonged strict border control and the quarantine measures could also affect business sentiment and encourage some of the foreign companies and expatriates to relocate, which is actually happening to some degree at this moment.
Yeah.
Thank you.
All right.
Let me just
Please.
The factual correction. I think you mentioned growth this year was 6.4. It's 82.8%. Last year was 6.4%. No, anyway, yeah.
Oh yes, that's right.
Yes.
Thanks for the call. Apologies for that.
Okay, quick clarification there. Hui, we have talked all around the region. Let's talk right now about right here in Singapore. Inflation has increased significantly here in the city-state since late last year. Has the MAS fallen behind the curve? Do you think the MAS should have tightened its exchange rate policy by more than it did in January? What are your thoughts on what's happening with the MAS in Singapore?
Well, MAS was one of the earliest to tighten its policy. MAS has always been very preemptive and concerned about high inflation. And I used to work there, so I can speak. So yes, they started raising rate last October, and then in January of this year, they have an inter-meeting tightening of the policy. So they saw inflation coming, and they were, of course, very preemptive and started tightening before inflation goes up. But as it turns out, that was in January, and don't forget the war in Ukraine, erupted in February. And since then, of course, there have been even more pressure on inflation because of commodity prices, So inflation is expected to ratchet up even further now. And I have no doubt that, MAS will respond in April or early May at the next monetary policy meeting in order to contain the inflation. But because inflation is so well anchored in Singapore, I think there's no risk of runaway inflation over which price spiral. And I think MAS is on the ball and will be able to respond appropriately. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much. We're going to leave our Q&A session for now, but I want to thank Hui and Anthony for fielding a variety of questions from around the region and hopefully giving us all some good insights today. We do want to thank all of you for tuning in today, especially members of the media. Please go to the AMRO website and download the report, the press release, the PowerPoint presentation. You can see those links right at the end of this broadcast. And please do join us again tomorrow, April the 13th, same time at 10:30 a.m. in Singapore for a conversation on the ASEAN+3's growth strategy. You can see our panelists tomorrow on the screen right now. It's not too late to sign up. For details and to register, please go to AMRO-livestream.com. We do, in fact, hope that you will join us for that event. Until then, I'm Glenn Van Zutphen. We hope to see you tomorrow. Thanks for joining us today.